So we're here in Tennant Creek at the Art and Culture Centre, Ninkinuyu. I'm Bevil. I'm the resident artist for 4 months, and on display here we've got The Invaded, an Australian history, which is my take on what happened. It's contact between the Aboriginal people here and the non-Aboriginal invaders. So the first 8 canvases are about pre-contact. So this one represents home. So you've got a Central Australian scene here maybe, with Pinterby up there drinking and people living in and grinding and kids playing. And the next story looks at hunting, and so we've got people burning the country and then looking for witchetty grubs and other things, but hunting animals, and then eventually family groups eating the produce. The next one shows fishing, so living off the land before, and now this is rivers and living from the sea. So, and with technology as well. There's quite complex. These are tree bark canoes, and there's damming the rivers there. Like in Brewarrina, the eel traps down in Victoria, New South Wales, but this is Arnhem Land. So every state and territory is represented in this series. Here there's got a law. This looks at law. So somebody's being accused of doing something wrong, and then there's the elders is going to throw spears up to a certain amount of punishment, and so that happens. But so this is represented in these possum skin coats in Victoria. Here we've got mortuary rites, very complex mortuary rites all over Australia. And this is actually based on paintings from the 1830s from Joseph Lycett. So it doesn't represent anything that's happening now. It's old, from over 100, nearly 200 years ago. We've got high culture. So there's dance, there's body painting, there's music, there's singing. This is a dance at Borroloola. These are Brolga dance. So the Brolga is represented by on the body art. Up until the 1920s, for a few hundred years, there was a lot of trading with Macassans from Indonesia, Sulawesi, who came and bartered for bêche la mer, a sea cucumber, and so took back on the trade winds. They came on one trade wind and went back, and they bartered for the bêche la mer. They bartered tobacco, steel products like knives and axes, and cloth as well, typically, other things probably as well. So that's the end of that pre-contact. Then we get the story of Cook getting these instructions from George III, going to monitor the transit of Venus in the Pacific, and eventually, after New Zealand, they came here. So there's the different stance here. The Aboriginal people, non-aggressive stance, just there, but the invaders, certainly an aggressive stance. But yeah. And then they went left, but not that many years later, we've got the First Fleet leaving Britain. So there's, on that top left, there's Stonehenge representing ancient Britain, which is really respected still, and the 11 ships from the First Fleet setting off and then arriving here in Australia. 2,500 people made home there for a while anyway, in Sydney Cove. So here's the local Aboriginal people. I see them as fascinated by what these ghosts are doing, and just at the end of the day thinking, what are they doing? So, I don't know if they were thinking that, but yeah, maybe. Suddenly, 2,500 people making up home in Sydney Cove, that it's recorded in journals that there was overfishing. The local people started suffering malnutrition and starvation because there were only maybe a few hundred people in that area at the time. 2,500 people turned up, and overfishing, was rife. The invaders, colonists, slowly took over Parramatta Way and knocked down the trees, put up fences, and introduced domestic stock from Europe. And the local people, I see them as being dumbfounded. What's happening here? But they found that these sheep were really easy to go up and hit on the head and take off because, But of course, the farmer over there thinks, hey, that belongs to me, and so shoots. So there's shooting of locals just for taking what they see as from the land, 1830, so 40 years later, the governor in Tasmania said, I want all of us to walk across down the island. It was called the Black Line, so for 1830, and to get rid of the local Aboriginal people. It wasn't totally successful, but they did disrupt Aboriginal life there. And, Robinson is thought of, there's a famous painting with Robinson and Truganini, not all happy, but actually they were trying to get rid of people from Tasmania. And, they succeeded. The descendants are, remember being taken. Everybody's been shipped off to islands off the coast of Tasmania. Here we've got a scene. Poisoning water holes went on all over Australia, destocking the land of Aboriginal people. And so this is set the Devil's Marbles, just south of Tennant Creek. And, the white fellas go off, the local family comes and drinks the water and poisoned, dies. And that happened all over. In the 19th century, the eugenics mob were looking at taking local skeletons from all over the world, Africa and India and Asia and Australia, and measuring them, looking at how inferior they were to European, sophisticated, educated people. And so, many of those remains have been returned to Australia, but there's still significant amounts still overseas, still need to be returned. Here, this is a typical massacre scene. It looks simple, people being pushed over a cliff. They're either going to be shot or they jump off the cliff. And that happened all over Australia. The first sporting team to represent Australia was an Aboriginal team, Aboriginal cricket team, and they played at Lord's. When they returned, they generally were kept on reserves after that. It's not all it looks a good scene, and it was a good experience for them, although 2 died over there and are still buried in London. But when they came back, they weren't on an equal footing. They weren't, 1868, 1869, something like that. For the First World War, again, looks quite a good story. Local soldiers. You go into many people's homes and you'll see photographs of great-grandfathers, grandfathers in their slouch hats and stuff. But at first, they weren't accepted to join the army because they said they were physically unfit, i.e. they were black. Later, when they were dying by thousands in the trenches in France, then they started accepting more of them, more Aboriginal people, because, they were dying anyway. another sad part of the history. A lot of this is the stolen generation. Kids of mixed race being taken away from the parents. And this happened until the 1970s. I'm not sure when it started. They were kept in orphanages in Darwin, all over the place. And their future was working as servants around Australia. But they were taken away from home. They lost their country, lost their family, lost their language, lost their culture. Another stolen thing is the stolen wages from especially rural workers in especially Queensland and Western Australia. So they were underpaid, and then the profits were taken to the banks, and the corporate farms became wealthy, and that's still an ongoing issue now. In the 1950s, the Australian government allowed Britain to come and test atom bombs in Australia. Started on the islands just off of the coast of Western Australia, eventually going to Maralinga in South Australia. But before that, the two devices, Totem 1 and Totem 2, were set off further away from Maralinga. And a friend of mine was living 160 kilometres away. The cloud from one of those devices came over where he lived, and 10 years later, he lost his eyes. His father was teaching him to ride. He was a ringer on the property where they lived, but when he was 16, he got cancer of the eyes, and his eyes were taken out, and so he never saw anything again. So, yeah, that's just his story, but it's about the destruction, willful disrespecting and polluting of land, Aboriginal land. 1965, Charlie Perkins and some other students and people from the University of Sydney went on a bus ride called the Freedom Ride around rural New South Wales, and here there's depicted is Moree swimming pool, public swimming pool, which you can't come in here. This is for white people only. And Perkins said, no, sorry, that's against the law, and the mayor agreed, and so he had to let them in. So he changed that, and they went to Walgett, where there's discrimination in the cinema with black entrance and white entrance, black seats, white seats, just like South Africa and America. All around Australia, mining, let's see, this is a mining magnate, let's call him Lang Hancock, flying over the Hammersleys thinking, hey, that looks like iron ore down there. So the people living off the land, he comes back and takes samples. Meanwhile, the people are painting the land, dancing, that is their country that they respect. 2 generations later, you have Lang's daughter, Gina Reinhardt, the wealthiest woman in Australia. But the 2 generations, the descendants of those people that lived on that country are excluded from both the wealth of the mining and also the cultural connection to the country. They're just excluded. They can't go there. So that's that. In 1972, 4 guys went up from Sydney up to Canberra and set up the tent embassy. This is a few months later, but they just they said, look, it was taken down, the embassies were taken down, but then eventually the court said, no, this is Canberra, it's fine to have an embassy here. And so that was made legal, I suppose. But those early ones were taken down. This is not the first one. But you notice that the Aboriginal flag at the moment is not up there. These were flags that were being flown in 1972. one of the most difficult paintings to paint was this one here, this story, Deaths in Custody, because I didn't want to reflect the sadness that people went through from other places. So I made up this story of a guy walking in a suit and somebody gets rolled by the police, and here's the harbinger of death, the owl foretelling the death, and eventually relations come and take the body away, and you've got the chalk lines in the jail. So that's still happening, sadly. In the 90s, you had the Wick decision and the Mabo decision at the High Court in Australia with a full bench, seven judges, who said terra nullius was illegal. Aboriginal people have ongoing connection with this country. This should be made law, and so the laws were changed because of the Wick and Mabo decisions. Very topical. A few months ago, Rio Tinto blew up a cave that had been around for 40,000 years. Was anthropologists, a lot of stuff in there, so they blew it up because they want to extend their mine. They were fined a bit, but So this shows thousands of years ago in the Burrup Peninsula in Western Australia, the largest gallery of petroglyphs, rock art in the world, maybe over 100,000 petroglyphs. This was made over between something like 5,000 and 2,000 BC. But now the land, I found a quote from an electrician, a Woodside electrician, saying, "Yeah, I've seen rocks being taken away by front-end loaders and then crushed up for road base." So there's my story. Just totally disrespecting this Australian history. Tens of thousands of years old. The second last thing is here, the intervention, the Northern Territory intervention. John Howard's and his mates deciding that Aboriginal people out in the bush in the Northern Territory can't look after their own welfare, taking the money away. And so you've got the basics card down here, which some of the money is put aside for only a certain food and essentials. But, this doesn't happen in non-Aboriginal communities, just in Aboriginal communities in the Territory. Finally, you've got the story. This is about a family. It's about this. This is a big question mark. What is going to happen now? What's the next thing to happen? Is it going to be good news? Or is it going to be bad news? Depends. And Australia needs to think about that because, as you can see, there's a lot of injustice being going around. And I've tried to show that in a even-handed way, but most of the stuff that I see is being pretty bad. And so that's the end.